going to be pleasant or dull within the first 30 seconds. Do you agree? And yes or no? If yes or no, what are the implications of that? So you know, the person shows up, or you meet them, or whatever the situation is, and in 30 seconds you have an impression. So is that possible, that you can decide how the date's going to go that quickly? And then what does that mean if you do? You can show support when comforting someone through nonverbals, and we are most likely to convey negative messages non-verbally than to announce our dislike of someone or something. In other words, we probably would not directly tell someone what we think or what we feel, but our nonverbals can communicate that. And so, the age-old, little scenario where you go, your chicken casserole is delicious. And then as soon as they leave, you're like, and interestingly, there was a commercial for a while where someone had cooked, and as soon as she goes to get more, or she goes to the kitchen or something, like somebody throws it up in the light fixture and someone shoves it in the flower arrangement that's like the centerpiece on the table, and someone feeds it to the dog, and they're all like trying as fast as they can to clear their plates when she leaves the kitchen, and then she comes back out and says, "Oh my gosh, you loved it so much, let me give you more," and it totally defeated the purpose. And so, again, that was one of those things where what they said to her was, "Oh no, it's really, really good," but the negative message was communicated non-verbally in their behaviors. So we always try to do that. We try to save face, if you will, with what we say, but then sometimes our nonverbals don't match up with that. Okay, so if you're talking about nonverbals within relationships, are nonverbal cues only important when we initiate relationships, or are they important during maintenance? So consider that. Think about any long-term relationship you may have. When you're maintaining that relationship, is it also important for nonverbal cues at that time? I would argue yes, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Are they part of developing a mature relationship? And here's a scenario for you. Long married couples spend less time verbalizing feelings and emotions. And so your initial impression of that may be, oh gosh, well then, obviously the longer you're married, the worse the relationship is. Not true. They actually learn to interpret each other's subtle nonverbal cues. So it's not that they are not understanding the feelings and emotions as well. It's actually that they're understanding them better, and they don't need to talk about them as much. They actually are kind of in sync with each other enough that the subtle nonverbal cues are enough without actually having to spend the time speaking about those feelings and emotions. So I'm curious, do you think this is a good thing? And or do you think it's effective? I don't know how many of you all are married. I know some of you are. Some of you have shared in your posts about your spouses. So if you've been in a relationship for a long time, or you're married, what do you think about that? If you're in a mature relationship, is it effective or good to not have to talk about your feelings because you kind of understand without being told? So interested to hear about that. I've been married for 9+ years and together for 11+ years. So I think for me at least it's true, but I'd like to hear what you all think. Research shows that marital satisfaction is enhanced when a spouse, and I capitalized this because this is the crucial word here, accurately interprets nonverbal cues. So married couples will report higher levels of satisfaction if their spouse accurately interprets their nonverbals. But to play devil's advocate a little bit, what would happen with inaccuracy? So is that to say that if they inaccurately interpret nonverbal cues, that their marital satisfaction would go down? Do you think that might be the case? And if so, what might be the ramifications of that? So some relationship questions for you. All right, so if we talk about interpreting nonverbals and what challenges may come out of that, we've already discussed that nonverbal messages are ambiguous. Nonverbal messages are continuous. So gestures flow from one situation to the next. In other words, that, when you're in, remember we said it's transactional, but that also means that one nonverbal cue that happened several minutes ago triggers others, and so they just continue to flow and you almost can't stop them. So there's not really nonverbal gesture break, nonverbal gesture break. It's more of a constant ebb and flow of those nonverbals. So it's very difficult to pinpoint accurately specific ones that are independent of anything else. Nonverbal messages are multi-channeled. So like we talked about, you will often have 3 or 4 nonverbals being communicated at once. And you can only remember when we talked about attending in the receiving the messages, you can only attend to one message at a time. So if someone throws 3 or 4 nonverbals at you almost simultaneously, your brain has to attend to one more than the others, so you may lose some of the others that were communicated. And nonverbal interpretation is culture-based. So I'm curious, especially for any of you that may be from a different culture, what are examples of culturally explicit nonverbal gestures? So if you are aware of, Euro-American gesturing and whatever culture you may, have learned gestures in, I'd be interested to hear what you can pinpoint as examples of culturally explicit nonverbal gestures. I know often some of the gestures that we would use are offensive in other cultures. I have heard of that. I'm not specifically sure of which ones. I know as a personal example, I lived in Honduras for several summers and taught English, and I also visited Panama. So, and I speak Spanish. So most of my cultural awareness is Latin America, Central America. But what's interesting is, and I had many, many friends in undergraduate that in my college, they recruited a lot of Hispanics to play soccer. So I hung out with a lot of Hispanic friends when I was in college. And what's interesting is I learned that gestures were very unique to culture. And like for one of the examples, we often in America, if we want someone to come here, we hold our palm up and do like the come here motion where we draw our fingers toward us. Well, so many times I would be interacting with the Latinos or whatever, and they would curl their finger, they had their palm down and they would curl their fingers back toward themselves. But what's interesting is that is in American culture, that's more, even though they're actually curling it toward them, it can be interpreted as that they're also bringing their fingers away, which in our culture is kind of like shoo, like go away. And so they'd often do that to me, and I was so confused. And so it took a while for me to figure out, okay, that's like their come here, where we have our palm up, they have their palm down. So, that was a very culturally explicit nonverbal gesture that I was clearly confused on, and had to kind of work through that and figure that out. And so, like, even the idea of like the okay, that symbol, I would argue that's probably not universal. I'm sure in another culture you do that and they look at you and say, you're holding 3 fingers up, fantastic. And speaking of which, totally an aside, but my son is counting. And so, most people will count starting with their pointer, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 is their thumb. Well, he just turned 2 Thursday. And so we're trying to tell him, if we say, how old are you now? We want him to say 2. And so we'll say, you're 2. Well, when he counts, he starts with his pinky, and he's been doing that for a very long time. So he says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if we say you're 2, he goes 2 and holds up his 2 outside fingers. So that's kind of my son's little, explicit nonverbal gesture that doesn't necessarily line up with ours. But as you can see, nonverbal gestures are ambiguous and they're multi-channeled and they're culture-based. So there's so many things that can make it very difficult to interpret them effectively. So, your activity for the week. I would like you to determine what nonverbal behaviors you believe can be interpreted universally and without question. So anyone, anywhere in the world, from any culture, from any race, from any religion, what are nonverbal behaviors that could be interpreted without question to mean the same thing? And you may come up with 5, you may come up with 50. That's really not the point. I'd really just like you to consider what you would say are universal nonverbal behaviors. then I would like you to post your top, I guess I didn't give you a number, let's say your top 3 choices. So once you have your list, pick what you would say are your best 3 and post those in your reflection post this week. And then we will be able to create the ironclad list of universal behaviors. And I say that somewhat in jest because nothing is ironclad when it comes to communication, but especially nonverbal communication. But I would like us to be able to look at, what we would say are universal, without question, nonverbal behaviors that would be interpreted accurately. Okay, so let's talk about dating for a little bit. I'm sure that's important to a lot of you. If you're thinking about courtship readiness, in other words, you are just ready to go on your date, and what do? We suck in our stomach, we stand up straight, we want to look very presentable, and we want to convey a certain image. There's also the element of preening, where we, if you will, manipulate our appearance. And that was actually one of the reflection questions we talked about early on. Is it ethical to manipulate your appearance? And some of you shared with me your thoughts on that. So, we do our hair and we do makeup and we wear nice clothes. And so we do these things that present a certain image. We also use positional cues. So we use our body posture and our body positioning to get noticed. And I think certain people do this a lot more than others, but there are definitely postures and positions that attract attention. And so we use those positional cues to garner attention from other people. And we appeal to invitation. So our behaviors will use proximity, meaning we try to be close to the other person. We expose skin. We use open body positions. We use eye contact. All of those things signal availability and interest. So if you look at those 4 categories, if you will, for, that dating, drawing someone's attention because you think they're attractive, etc., those behaviors are very purposeful, but none of them are spoken. So it's very interesting that the beginning of a relationship, you could argue, is all nonverbal, because you have to be interested in someone before you actually strike up a conversation. So, I'm curious what you think about those things. Can you think of others that you think belong in quasi-courtship behavior? Can you argue that some of those you don't necessarily think are as important? Just share with me your thoughts if you'd like to in the reflection on that. So if we're talking about nonverbal communication codes, there are 6 kind of categories for those things. So you have movement and gestures. The way that we move our body, the way that we gesture with our hands, those are a certain type of communication code. Then you have eye contact. That's pretty self-explanatory. You have facial expressions. You have your use of space and territory, and we'll actually talk about that a little bit later. We'll actually talk about most of these later. We have touch, and then you have personal appearance. So those 6 main categories kind of define the way that we nonverbally communicate. And we can kind of code behaviors. If you, from here on forward, if you watch someone's nonverbals, you'll probably be able to code out of these 6 categories what they're doing. So are they using movement? Are they using eye contact? Are they using facial expressions? And you'll actually be able to recognize and code those nonverbals, which is kind of fun. Maybe I'm the only one that thinks it's fun. I don't know. I think it's fun. But I'm also the therapist, so I guess that's kind of what I do for a living too. But anyway, okay, so movement and gestures. Let's talk about these a little more in detail. Your body orientation and your posture provide cues to your interest and willingness. So especially with the dating and the courtship, that applies, but with anything. If you are meeting your new boss for the first time, or you're meeting a professor for the first time, the way that you hold your body and the way that you posture yourself, it provides interest. It provides cues to show that your interest, or you have willingness or whatever. So you need to be very aware of the way that you hold your body. When you like someone, there are very specific movements and gestures that are common.